Welcome to Newt's World Podcast on the iHeart Podcast Network. You know, it's been an amazing week. I have to tell you, I don't fully know what President Trump and Xi Jinping talked about, what they agreed to. The comments from the Chinese are in some ways dramatically different from the comments by the Americans. There's a little bit of nervousness because President Trump told reporters that they talked a lot about Taiwan and that he's not yet made a decision about a $14 billion weapons deal that the Congress is strongly in favor of, the Taiwanese are strongly in favor of. And I think that it would be a really bad signal if that was blocked, because it would send a signal of weakness, and we do not want to tempt Xi Jinping to try to take Taiwan. So we'll see. But I do think that to me was a little bit worrisome. And frankly, I don't think we understand what happened in the meetings, because there's a huge gap between what the Chinese are saying and what the American team is saying. And a different topic that I'm fascinated by, there's a new Gallup poll out that shows that 7 out of 10 Americans oppose a data center being built near them. Now, I don't quite understand why data centers have suddenly become a problem, as long as the data center provides its own electricity. But 48% of the American people strongly oppose a data center being set up near them, and 56% of Democrats oppose about 39% of Republicans. At the same time, 53% of Americans say they oppose building a nuclear energy plant in their area. The French got over that one time because there was a period where if you had a nuclear power plant in your area, your price of electricity went down very dramatically. And the French had very few people who were complaining because they liked the lower price so much. I think that this is a real challenge. Now, what makes it really intriguing is Elon Musk and others, including now Jeff Bezos, are talking about putting data centers in space, which is a very interesting, very complicated question. And one of the major steps towards being able to do that, they'll launch the Starship, which is the largest rocket, bigger than the Saturn V, which went to the moon. It is totally reusable and will bring down the price of launches by an enormous amount. So there's serious talk that presently we'll start putting data centers in space, and that will just eliminate the not in my backyard, because instead it will be overhead. Coming up, I'll be joined by author and historian Laurence Jurdem. We're going to discuss his new book, 41, George H.W. Bush and the End of the American Establishment. I am really pleased to welcome my guest, author and historian Laurence Jurdem. He is a visiting professor of U.S. history at Fairfield University, and his new book, 41, George H.W. Bush and the End of the American Establishment, is out now. Laurence, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, it's a great privilege to be with you today.
You know, I started with Bush, both when he was vice president and then when he was president, so I'm intrigued by the way you've approached this. Let's start at the beginning with this deep sense, which I admire, of duty and patriotism, which I think probably goes back to his father and his grandfather.
Yes, it's something that was really inculcated in President Bush, going back, as you said, to his father, Senator Prescott Bush, his mother, Dorothy Walker. The Bushes grew up very much with the principles and the ideas that I think many of those of the founding generation possessed, in terms of the importance of reputation, the importance of virtue, the importance of disinterestedness, the importance of education, and the idea of being a symbol to other Americans who looked up to so many of those who were involved in the founding. So Bush grew up with these ideas, and they were continued to be inculcated within him as he began his journey and went to Phillips Academy and Yale, Skull and Bones, all of these incredible things where he subsequently really came to understand these principles and saw them as so important to his growth and the growth of the country.
Would you say that it's legitimate to suggest that he grew up as a patrician?
I think so. I mean, he grew up with great affluence, grew up with great opportunity. But the thing that's so interesting is that George Bush took advantage of every single opportunity that he was given. And he did that not in a selfish way. He did that because he wanted to achieve something significant, something great. He wanted to serve others, and he believed in taking advantage, whether it was education, whether it was mentoring under people like Dwight Eisenhower, his incredible understanding and access to government and leadership. All of these things, I think, prepared him for this incredible apprenticeship that he began, and then all of which culminated in his time in the White House.
You have to respect, I think it's accurate, that he was the youngest naval fighter pilot in World War II, and he got shot down.
Yes, I think the war did a lot to that generation. I think he went in, as he said, he was a scared little guy. He didn't know anybody, but he came out of Andover after listening to people like Henry Stimson kind of encourage people that his contemporaries to serve the greater good, to undertake a mission that was greater than themselves. And I think the war really helped him grow up. As he said, I think you see that after he returns from the war and goes to Yale. And there were a lot of people who thought that this group of men returning from combat wouldn't have the intellectual ability, the rigor, the discipline to complete their education. And Bush, along with many of his contemporaries, returned to Yale. And tons of them ended up being on the honor roll, all of these veterans. So you see the discipline and commitment that I think the war was responsible for in imbuing within these men that sense of mission, something that President Bush undertook and I think really symbolized his whole career.
When he was shot down, his two other aviators in the plum bomber with him both died. Bush himself went into the ocean and was saved by an American submarine. How much do you think he was affected by having been the pilot and having survived while his two teammates died?
Oh, I think it was a fundamental experience for him. I think he said, in fact, that he never stopped thinking about those two men who were with him. And in fact, perhaps you could almost say that the loss of those men motivated him to realize that he had been spared and he owed it to them to do something significant with his life because he really did believe that he was spared. He couldn't understand. He wrote to his parents why those two men were gone and why he was still there. I think it really scarred him during his time on the USS Finback, which was the submarine you made reference to. He would stand up on deck at night and look out to sea and realize how important all of those values, family, community, that his parents had imbued within him, how important they were, how much he appreciated having them. And I think that, again, the loss of those two men further enhanced that sense of mission, something that you really get a sense when you listen to his 1988 convention speech, and he really talks about that period of service in his life. You really get a sense of how important it was to him.
Now, when he comes back home, he ends up at Yale. How big an influence is that?
I think it was somewhat of an influence. I think Phillips Academy was far greater of an influence, as he has said. But again, George Bush was all about friendship. He was all about creating relationships. And I feel like this was another example where he was able to build relationships with all these different people. He got to play baseball, obviously, which was a great love of his. He played first base. But I think there was a really interesting moment there, and it shows you the importance of him, how he was willing to listen to just about anybody if he believed it would help him improve his ability. There was a groundskeeper at Yale who had watched him play baseball and noticed that the reason he wasn't hitting was because he wasn't hitting up on the ball. And this groundskeeper wrote George Bush a letter and explained this to him. And Bush read the letter, took that advice for what it was worth, and proceeded to raise his batting average and took his Yale team to the College World Series on 2 different occasions. So listening and learning were a big part of his life. And you see that throughout even his earliest years.
Now, normally, if you came out of Connecticut, your family was that important, you went to Yale, you normally would go to New York, probably into finance. But Bush decides to go to Texas. What do you think went into that in terms of his own thinking?
While certainly he had said, quoted very bluntly to a friend of his that he did not want to go to Connecticut and, quote, be Press Bush's boy, I think there's something a lot bigger that went on there. And this goes back to the conversation that you had with Arthur Herman, talking about the fire, the ideas that the founders were responsible for creating in terms of the fundamental ideas that made this country so great. That idea of risk, that idea of being able to rise based on individual ability and talent, that entrepreneurial spirit, and that creativity. The fact that Mr. Herman, I believe, said that people like Henry Ford, people like John D. Rockefeller were their own founders. And we could say the same thing about President Bush. He wanted to go a different path. He embraced what his hero Theodore Roosevelt referred to as the strenuous life. He wanted to do things that were outside his comfort zone, things that were a little bit risky, uncertain, and he wanted to make his mark. And I think that's exactly what he did in terms of the oil business.
From Bush's standpoint, he is living out a life of discipline. He's living out a life that I think he saw as patriotic. And he goes to Texas and he gets into the oil business, which is very different from Connecticut. How would you rate his effectiveness in private enterprise in the Texas business?
He was willing to go into a situation and realize he didn't have any of the answers. And this is where President Bush was so wonderful at attaching himself and learning from older men, men who were seasoned, men who were experienced, very much the way Lyndon Johnson did, I think, as he was rising in his own life. And President Bush spent time working for Neil Mallon for the Dresser firm. He did the most menial tasks, but at the same time, he learned how the fundamentals of the oil business worked. And after learning a little bit, he realized he wanted more. He wanted to achieve that success that was so fundamentally important for so many in America. And so he decided, I'm going to open up my own oil firm. And using that great charm and ability to create relationships, that's what he ended up doing. And he was a great success at it. He took risks. They took an enormous risk on a new drill that had never really been used before in order to do some drilling elsewhere. And it turned out to be an enormous success for them. So George Bush was all about risk. He was not a guy who was willing to kind of hang out, take the train back to Greenwich and have a few martinis. He had grit. He had determination. And that's why he's so representative, I think, of all of our presidents. All these guys had grit, determination, and a desire to achieve something significant.
I think it's significant that after the disastrous Goldwater defeat, that Bush goes to National Review and writes a piece arguing basically that we have to be a broader, not a narrower party, which sort of clearly puts him in the non-Goldwater wing of the party.
Yes, I would say that so much of President Bush's political worldview, even though he was a conservative, even though he did embrace Goldwater's idea of a more sort of aggressive position with the Soviet Union, he very much was about deregulation, but Bush was like William F. Buckley Jr., very much of a pragmatist, very much wanted to do whatever was necessary that would allow the party to win. And so that was the way he viewed it. But I would say in terms of his own politics, he really comes out of the Eisenhower wing of the party, or what we might call, or what had been at one point, that northeastern wing of the Republican Party. So Bush was all about winning, but he understood this narrow point of view was not going to be successful. And obviously, William F. Buckley Jr. thought about it as well and understood that someone other than Buckley, and that person would eventually be Ronald Reagan, they needed a broader message and perhaps a bit more of a less sort of harsh candidate, let's say, in their delivery.
You quote one of his speechwriters saying that in Bush's mind, the nitty-gritty boorishness of campaigning for office was wholly distinct from the lofty business of actually governing the nation. What you had to say to get elected had no real bearing on or relationship to what you subsequently did once elected. When I read that, I was reminded of Theodore White's comment about Adlai Stevenson, that he was like somebody who liked dating but didn't like sex. He never understood the essence of politics, which was a lot more than dating. He disdained all the things that are at the heart of politics. And I'm curious, Bush decides to go out in a big way and runs for the U.S. Senate in Texas at that point. Pretty gutsy decision. How would you rate his first campaign?
I would rate his first campaign as somebody who was learning, but we also see that real ambition there. And this was something that George Bush struggled with, right? It's like, well, how far should I go to win? How important is doing things which perhaps may not be the most authentic to me to achieve victory? And I think he lost to Senator Yarborough because he wasn't authentic. Obviously, Yarborough was a popular candidate. He was the incumbent senator, I believe, at that particular time. But Bush was doing things and saying things that were deliberately done to appeal to the Goldwater wave that was sweeping through the country. In 1964, Bush thought perhaps I have a chance to win because, of course, Senator John Tower had won several years earlier, and he thought that Texas was the state that was becoming what eventually it now is, that ruby red state. And Bush believed he would use the circumstances to try to achieve victory. But it didn't go well for him, and I think it was because people saw through him. They saw that he didn't really believe what he was saying. And he later said that I regretted many of the things that I said, and I hope I don't do it again.
It was very funny. When he finally gets to Lee Atwater as an advisor, Atwater has him eating pork rind to prove that he's really Southern, which I think had almost nothing to do with how Bush personally felt. But when Bush does lose the second time in the Senate, it's suggested that he try to become ambassador to the United Nations. And he did know Nixon. He'd known Eisenhower pretty well. Eisenhower liked him. What did you feel was the relationship between Bush and Nixon?
You know, it's wonderful to see because, as you know, when I recall listening to a speech that you gave at the Nixon Library, where you talked about Nixon and how the media really pegs him as this really nasty man. And certainly Richard Nixon was a complicated figure, as we know. But during his relationship with George Bush, we see a guy who really, liked George Bush. I think he liked his father quite a bit as well. But we see a man who really wants to bring Bush into the arena, so to speak, make him feel at home, teach him, give him that experience. And Bush really, he adored Richard Nixon. I think he was devastated by the tapes that he ended up hearing about Watergate. But you really get a sense of the kindness, the generosity, the incredible mentorship that Nixon gave him. And you see this throughout Bush's career because Bush constantly still, throughout his time as vice president, as president, he consulted Nixon. He reached out to him. He asked him for advice. So this was a deep friendship. And obviously, certainly, we can't take away from the fact that Bush was severely hurt by Nixon's Watergate situation. So it's an interesting relationship. When I really didn't know how close they were or how kind Nixon had been to him.
You also make a very interesting point I had not thought about, which is that Nixon and Kissinger operated almost entirely through personal connectivity rather than bureaucracy. And you suggest that Bush learned this pattern of having personal relationships that got things done, and that was a significant break from the sort of more bureaucratic approach. Could you expand a little bit on that, how you think it influenced Bush?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One, Chase Untermeyer, who served as Bush's director of personnel, made a really interesting observation, and I think a memoir that he wrote, where he said President Bush was the first person, in his opinion or his view, since George Washington, who knew every single person within his cabinet before he appointed them. And I think this really says a lot about Bush's love of people, his love of creating relationships. He said about during his tenure at the UN, he said, you can't do this business if you don't like people. And I think that's emblematic of politics as well. But Bush, throughout all of his positions in public life, created friendships, whether it was King Hussein, whether it was King Fahd of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, that great relationship he had with James Baker went back to 1958 at the Houston Tennis Club, where they were doubles partners together. But Bush very much liked to sit with people that he trusted, that he could count on, that were loyal to him. Again, that conversation you had with Arthur Herman, Mr. Herman brings up a lot of this in regards to President Trump, how President Trump is with people and works with people who he trusts, who he knows are not going to go off the reservation and do things that are going to be counter to his interests. And I think George Bush was very much the same thing. Loyalty was enormously important to him. And we again see that with President Nixon. President Bush was one of the last people to suggest that Nixon resign after the smoking gun tape came out. But Bush was all about friendship. He was all about building bridges. He was all about creating relationships. And this served him remarkably well during the presidency and throughout his whole life.
Now, you suggest that as much as he admired Kissinger, that when he was serving them, I think he ended up as the liaison in China, he and Kissinger clashed, even though he deeply admired Kissinger.
Yes, he admired Kissinger intellectually. He learned a lot from him, I think, because I think both Kissinger and Bush were very much foreign policy realists. And I think that Bush learned a lot from him. But again, George Bush was all about making people around him comfortable so they could give him honest opinions and honest assessments. And I think what Bush didn't like was this micromanagement that Kissinger involved himself in the manner of foreign policy. When Bush was in China, Kissinger would come over, and Bush, who had a marvelous ability to portray people and great caricatures because he was a writer and he wrote all the time in all these different journals. And you would read about Kissinger, and Bush couldn't understand how or why Kissinger terrified so many of his underlings and made their lives a living hell. He's like, you can't work with people like that. They're not going to give you what you really want to hear. They're going to give you what they think you want to hear. And Bush was completely counter in regards to that. And he really lets Kissinger have it at one point in the journal. He said, I'm trying to work really hard here. I'm trying to get this China vote through the UN to work. Kissinger doesn't seem to respect that. He needs to get it through his head that I'm not someone there to undercut him. So you really see in these journals the Bush temper coming out, which is not something that you saw. And I don't know, Mr. Speaker, you may have seen that temper when Bush was president behind the scenes, but certainly you didn't see it in public.
I don't think I ever saw it. I wasn't that close to him. When we had a big fight over the tax increase, I never felt personally any kind of temper. I think they regarded it as a huge break of faith, and they thought that I was basically a traitor. They were sort of bitter, but there was no demonstration of temper, let me put it that way. Do you think when Bush considered running for president, and here's the guy who's lost twice for the Senate, hasn't won, was chair of the RNC, but doesn't really have any big track record, and It's a big jump to try to run for president. He, at least one level, showed great self-confidence that he could put together a national campaign.
We have to go back to that grit and that risk, that sense of risk. He finished his public career as a CIA director when President Carter comes in, and the question is, what's next? And he decides he's going to go back to Houston. He's going to put together a campaign with the slogan, "A president we will not have to train," which highlighting his years of service in all these different aspects of government. But it was also really tough because, as you know, after that kind of insurgency campaign that Reagan ran in 76, the party had really shifted by this point over to sort of, we can call it the West or American conservatism, whatever you want to call it. But Bush was really in the minority here. There was enormous love for Ronald Reagan. He really was the guy who a lot of people wanted and believed could win the nomination. And Bush ran a really powerful campaign on the basis of experience. You had those incredible debates in New Hampshire, and there was a lot of acrimony between he and Reagan during the 80 campaign. Reagan thought he was a lightweight. He was basically a spoiled brat. Bush thought Reagan was too old. He wasn't as smart as many people thought. And Reagan, it got under his skin. I mean, obviously, we know of the congenial and convivial Ronald Reagan, but he wasn't a happy guy during that campaign. And I don't think he was particularly thrilled initially with George Bush, but politics, as you know, makes strange bedfellows, and there you have it.
When we come back, we'll discuss how George H.W. Bush navigated the end of the Cold War, managing the collapse of the Soviet Union, his relationship with Mikhail Gorbachev, and the careful diplomacy that helped shape America's role in a rapidly changing world. Right after his election, Bush decides to go see Speaker Jim Wright instead of having Wright come to the White House. And I remember at the inauguration, he made very specific overture to Wright, all of which I thought was interesting because we were on the verge of forcing Wright to resign over corruption. In a way, Bush was providing cover for Wright. In the end, it didn't matter. It was sort of an interesting choice on his part, maybe partly because they're both from Texas or because it was Bush's strategy for legislation. I have to say, as a Republican partisan, I was more than a little bit offended by that experience. Do you have any insight on why he reached out so strongly to Wright?
I really think this goes back to the idea of building bridges and building relationships. When Bush was president, you probably know this as well, he kept his locker in the congressional gym, and he was up there working out, building relationships, obviously built a great relationship with Sonny Montgomery when Congressman Montgomery was in the chamber, and he would go up there and he loved, again, that's all about that personal touch, that personal diplomacy, trying to build relationships with key members. And Bush ultimately believed that he wanted a presidency where everybody could work together. And I think we may talk about this later, but that was why I think it was so important for him to get a congressional resolution on the first Gulf War. He wanted to work with Congress. He believed Congress was important. He had served in the Congress. He had enormous respect for institutions. And I think that was the central idea. He wanted government to work.
In terms of building relationships, and this is partly with Brent Scowcroft as his national security advisor, they really work very hard at trying to avoid humiliating Gorbachev. Almost like they're trying to help him unwind the Soviet Empire at minimum embarrassment. What do you think was going on in Bush's head as he watched the Soviet Union disintegrate?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to that character of George Bush, that humility, not using, as his mother used to say, don't be a braggadocio, don't go out there and make a scene. And I think also Bush was very well aware of the tenuous situation that Minister Gorbachev had, knowing that if Bush got up and, as George Mitchell said, danced on the Berlin Wall, this could lead to a lot of instability and violence in the Soviet Union, allowing the hardliners to come out and dispatch troops and really crack down on those individuals who were celebrating the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And he didn't want to do that. He did not, as he said, he was not going to stick his finger in Gorbachev's eye. And it served him well. It really was responsible for building this terrific relationship that the two men had.
When Saddam seizes Kuwait, Bush happens to be, I think, in Colorado with Margaret Thatcher, who says to him, "Don't go wobbly. You're going to have to do whatever it takes to get him out of there." Do you think that had any impact on Bush?
I think that Bush was able to look back, and I think if you look back in history, Bush was very familiar with what we call the lessons of Munich, understanding that the Second World War may well have been prevented if the Europeans had moved more rapidly to contain Adolf Hitler, as opposed to just saying, well, he'll eventually just burn out or calm down. Bush did not believe that, nor did Thatcher. They were who well remembered the Second World War. And Thatcher very much believed that Saddam, as she said, he won't stop there once he goes into Kuwait. He won't stop there. He's going to move further. And Bush very much believed that. And in fact, throughout the months up until the invasion of Kuwait, Bush referred to Saddam as Hitler on numerous occasions. And I had a marvelous chat with Bush's chief speechwriter, Chris Winston, who told me that the State Department would constantly be on the speechwriter's case saying, please stop having President Bush refer to Saddam Hussein as Hitler. And they would say, Mr. President, please don't refer to Saddam Hussein as Hitler. He kept doing it because this was an experience that he remembered. He was sitting in the chapel at Andover when Henry Stimson was making his graduation commencement address as France and the Netherlands fell to the Nazis. And this is something that was a fundamental experience, a fundamental moment in his life. And it clearly colored his experience in how to deal with Saddam Hussein.
When you look at that same parallel period, while we're in the middle of putting troops in the field, Bush ends up in a budget negotiation, which I actually was part of, out at Andrews Air Force Base. Do you think he had any notion how much damage he would do to himself by breaking the Read My Lips pledge?
He said it basically did him in. I think he knew that he had done irreparable damage to his chances of obtaining a second term. But I also think that he believed in fulfilling the greater good. Richard Nixon, as I think I quote in my book, said to Bush at one point, George, you were right about Reagan's voodoo economics. You're going to have to give the nation a tax increase. What's ironic, I think, Mr. Speaker, is that Ronald Reagan raised taxes on a number of different occasions, and it seems to be something that those who adore Ronald Reagan tend to either not remember or they tend not to talk about. But the key difference here was that Ronald Reagan was one of the great salesmen in American political history. Obviously, he was a marvelous oratory figure. He spoke beautifully. He really was the great communicator. President Bush was contrary to that. He hated the idea of selling policy. It was not something that was authentic because that meant he would be talking about himself and touting how great all of his policies were. And he just could not do that. And so I think this humility in the end was his own worst enemy. And I think that's what ultimately did him in terms of his inability to sell this idea to the country.
I think also because Peggy Noonan, in a sense, had taken him out on a limb with Read My Lips, No New Taxes, which was a great moment in the convention, but then pretty much meant you had to do it.
Yeah, and he loved that phrase. He didn't want to take it out of the speech. It was the biggest hit of the whole speech, right? He was not a great speech maker, but he worked really hard and he did a tremendous job. But that line, as I remember reading Richard Darman and others, wanted that line to go. And Miss Noonan would not take it out, nor would President Bush want it gone because he thought it was such a big applause getter in Houston that evening.
If your goal was to win the presidency, I was there the night he said it. It was a very effective line, but it did mean you had sort of trapped yourself. The other difference was nobody ever believed that Ronald Reagan wanted to raise taxes. It just didn't matter. Everybody understood that Reagan was for smaller government, lower taxes. When on a rare occasion, people like Darman talked him into doing something stupid, he would do it reluctantly and immediately go back to wanting to cut taxes.
Right.
It's just a total different communication. Coming up, we're going to discuss George H.W. Bush's legacy and what Laurence means by calling Bush the end of the American establishment. Bush, in many ways, was almost in the spirit of the classic patricians and people like Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin D. Roosevelt, John F. Kennedy, and really wanted to inspire people. Yet you suggest in a way that somehow he's the end of that era.
Yes, I think he is, and I think that we saw this in 2016. Now, clearly, we can celebrate President Bush and all of the expertise and experience that he had, and all of the expertise and experience presidents before him had. But clearly, the election of President Trump was about the fact that problems that existed in the country were not being solved. And you can also look at situations such as the financial crisis, nobody being held accountable for that, the disaster of the Iraq War, all of which were done under individuals in government of that great experience and expertise. And so I think President Bush, due to the fact that his administration was so successful in so many different ways, that was really the end of it. I mean, following President Bush, a devoted family man, a man who had great integrity, honor. He was incredibly honest and forthright. We have President Clinton, and, we don't need to go into all of the activities that occurred in that administration. Then obviously the disasters of the second Bush administration. And I think by that point, things were changing in the Republican Party. The other thing was, once the Cold War ended, the party no longer had anything to really unify behind until I think President Trump arrived in 2016. So Bush really was the end of that multi-generation of presidents that had expertise and experience that were once really valued and considered very important, but now I don't believe they really are anymore.
When George W. Bush comes along, he really is he's not a transplant from Connecticut, and he really represents a remarkably different style from his father. In that sense, I think you're right that when you start with Ross Perot's intervention in 92, the election of Clinton, you really have started the country down a very different road than you would have been if Bush had gotten reelected.
I think so. And the other thing, again, I think that George Bush, if you look at that 92 campaign and the difference between Clinton and Bush in terms of the joy that Bill Clinton had of going out there and campaigning, particularly that moment where he played his saxophone on the Arsenio Hall TV show with the sunglasses. And I remember watching that. And this is something that you would never or could never see George Bush doing. I always remember, going back to your point about debating Ross Perot, where Bush looked at his watch at one point. Right. And that really got everybody up in arms the next day. And I remember then watching, and I wrote about this, the interview with Jim Lehrer years later, and he said, "Mr. President, what were you thinking about when you looked at your watch?" And Bush said, "Well, only 2 more minutes of this crap, and then I'm done." And that really said it all. That really said the great disdain that Bush had for the whole campaign and politics of the show, which I think he really absolutely hated.
I think that's right. I interacted with him a couple of times. His position on abortion was entirely an artifact of what he thought was necessary to be a Republican nominee. And given the relationship that the family had had with Planned Parenthood. It was just agonizing to him, but he thought it was unavoidable. It's a fascinating case study. Laurence, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, 41, George H.W. Bush and the End of the American Establishment, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. It's a fascinating read, and I think it's important for anybody who wants to understand the arc of politics from the early 1960s, really up through today. I think George H.W. Bush is a very significant figure, and I appreciate your sharing with us.
Oh, well, Mr. Speaker, it was a great honor and privilege to speak with you. Thank you so much for the time.
Now I'm pleased to introduce a new segment of Newt's World where I answer listeners' questions. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Roman asks, quote, I recently saw your Fox appearance discussing the parallels between President Trump's political comeback and Jefferson's rise to the Democratic-Republican Party. Your comparison immediately caught my attention while reading James Madison by Richard Brookhiser in early 2024. What was especially striking was the position Jefferson and Madison found themselves in during the late 1790s, politically concentrated in Virginia and Kentucky, opposing the Federalist draconian restrictions on speech and the use of the Alien and Sedition Acts against those sympathetic to Jefferson, while attempting to build a broader national movement despite intense political hostility. President Trump likewise found himself politically isolated after 2020, operating largely from Florida, while the full majesty of the laws turned against him, with even close allies such as Peter Navarro imprisoned. Reading about Jefferson's and Madison's successful counteroffensive provided my only reason to hope for a Trump victory that year. Your comments made me curious whether there are any books you would especially recommend on Jefferson's Democratic-Republican coalition building, the election of 1800, and Republican opposition to the Federalists. Thank you for your time, and thank you as well for continuing to bring historical perspective into modern political discussions. Well, Roman, I recommend you go to ChatGPT, put in the Jeffersonian War against the Federalists, and ask for books. I did that recently, and I think 20 books came up. Many of them I'd never heard of, but there's actually a great deal of study that's been done over the last 200 years into the degree to which Jefferson literally set out to destroy, and did, the Federalist Party. It's remarkable, and it's very similar, I think, to the fight we're now in with the left-wing Democrats who are so deeply opposed to most American values. Let me say for all of you, I look forward to hearing from you. To ask a question, please email me at newt@gingrich360.com. Thank you to my guest, Laurence Jurdem. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan. Our researcher is Rachel Peters. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Join me on Substack at gingrich360.net. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.